Hello, my name is Frank Adkins, and I'm an instructor of automotive technology at Delaware Technical and Community College, Stanton, Delaware. Today we're going to be discussing combining the attributes of gasoline and diesel engines. Now, students in the engine performance class have already been through the evolution of the various fuel and ignition systems, starting with carburetors, progressing through the various types of fuel injection, and finally arriving at direct injection, which is where we are today, as well as ignition systems beginning with a Kettering or breaker points ignition, advancing through the different types of electronic ignition, the distributorless ignition, and so forth, and ending with coil and plug ignition, which again is where we are today, today's vehicles. Now, most of this evolution has been driven by a need for cleaner emissions. Emissions seems to be at the forefront of everything we do in the automotive world, and really have propelled most of the advances that we've seen over the last 40 years. Now, here we have our school program mascot, the 1964 Dodge Dart drag car, affectionately known as Rusty. And, well, if we look at not just the tire emissions, but exhaust emissions coming from Rusty, they're really not very clean. Through the years, we've been involved with CAFE, Corporate Average Fuel Economy. And our concerns with CAFE originated with trying to become less dependent on foreign fuel, foreign oil. But nowadays, there's been a renewed interest in CAFE, and really, it sounds like we're concerned with improving our gas mileage. That's part of it, but really what we're after is reducing greenhouse gases, the amount of carbon dioxide that we're spewing into the atmosphere. And the reason we're going after CAFE is because there's a direct correlation with the amount of fuel that we burn to the amount of carbon dioxide that we put out of the tailpipe. High corporate average fuel economy reduces our carbon dioxide emissions and has also spawned technology in these various areas here, from gasoline electric hybrids, plug-in hybrids, rolling down to fully electric vehicles, as well as advances to our gasoline and diesel engines. Now, in comparing gasoline and diesel engines, each has their own strengths. Gasoline, of course, all-around drivability, good cold weather operation. Currently, gasoline is a lot less expensive than diesel fuel. Hasn't always been the case, but that is certainly the case now. And gasoline engines also require less after-treatment of the exhaust. Hang a catalytic converter on the back of it, and that pretty much takes care of it. We don't have to have any particulate filters or any of the fluids that we use in the diesels. However, diesels are popular because they offer more torque and better fuel mileage than gasoline engines do typically. Well, what if we could combine the strengths of each? That's exactly what is happening right now in a joint venture between Delphi and Hyundai. They're doing this gasoline diesel compression ignition system. This is a joint venture between Delphi and Hyundai, and of course it's also being funded 50% by the federal government. But they're developing an engine that relies on compression ignition yet burns gasoline. In our typical gasoline engine, we're using a spark plug for ignition. And the spark ignition, well, it ignites the air-fuel mixture, but from that point forward, the flame front propagates across the top of the piston and across the combustion chamber. There's really no way of controlling the combustion. There's things that are taken into consideration with the design of the combustion chamber, sure. You know, we keep temperatures within a reasonable range, but at the forefront of this flame, we have a very high temperature flame front, and that leads to a lot of oxides of nitrogen emissions. Similarly, in a diesel, we compress the air, elevate its temperature, and then inject the diesel fuel. Well, once the diesel fuel starts burning, it's much like gasoline, sort of like a solid fuel rocket. It burns, and it just burns until it's gone. We don't really have any way of controlling the combustion as it's taking place. Over here, however, we do. We compress the air-fuel mixture, we compress the air, but inject the fuel, it's timed. So we can control the rate at which the fuel is injected into the air, and therefore control the rate of burn. And this results in a much lower peak temperature in the combustion chamber, and therefore much lower oxides of nitrogen emissions. The engine currently in development, it's a 1.8 liter inline four-cylinder with a very high 14.8 to 1 static compression ratio. It does have a supercharger for increased cylinder pressures at low speed without heating the air, and also a turbocharger for high-speed operation. more efficient in high-speed operation with the turbo than would be just relying entirely on the supercharger. Some of the attributes of this engine, and the ones that I really want to point out: electric variable valve timing, electronically controlled variable valve timing that is more responsive and also more accurate than what we have currently in use today. We're also relying very heavily on EGR. We have a gigantic EGR cooler that you'll see in just a little bit here, cooling that exhaust before we're allowing it to re-enter the combustion chamber. So again, very high static compression ratio. Forced induction equals higher cylinder temperatures, higher cylinder pressures, so it's easier to ignite the gasoline once we inject it. The gasoline is injected after top dead center. Now, in a normal spark ignition engine, we fire the spark plug before top dead center. Piston still coming up towards top dead center. As it reaches top dead center and then begins its downward movement through the power stroke, we're still burning the air-fuel mixture. And in most engines, we're shooting for peak cylinder pressure at about 23 degrees after top dead center, because again, once we start the fire, it just burns. By injecting the fuel directly into the cylinder and doing it after top dead center and controlling how fast we're dispensing the fuel into the cylinder, the combustion continues through the power stroke. Well, that's much like a diesel. The combustion in the diesel is much slower than the gasoline engine, and because of that, because the combustion takes place throughout the power stroke, diesels make so much more torque than a gasoline engine. So that's what we're doing here as well. The results? Well, we can combine with a very lean air-fuel mixture. That gives us better economy as well as less hydrocarbons and carbon monoxide. But because we're keeping temperatures within check and relying so heavily on EGR, we also have greatly reduced oxides of nitrogen emissions. Burning less fuel, reduced carbon dioxide. So it's a win all the way around as far as emissions are concerned. Gasoline direct compression ignition relies completely on compression ignition. Now, it is similar in some ways to homogeneous charge compression ignition. However, HCCI relies on spark ignition under some circumstances, like especially after a cold start. And because the transition from spark ignition to compression ignition can be kind of tricky, they are rather finicky. We don't have that problem with the GDCI because we're relying 100% on compression ignition. We have a centrally located fuel injector, and again, multiple late injections. So this is taking place throughout the power stroke, well after top dead center. The pressures that we're dealing with are much like gasoline direct injection, which we have out there now. Some differences to the valve train. Of course, it's variable, that's nothing new, but rebreath. And what rebreath means is that during the intake stroke, we actually kick the exhaust valve open to draw some of the exhaust gases back in with the air during the intake stroke. And that allows us better mixing of the exhaust gases with the air, as well as some internal EGR. Even with our extremely high compression ratio, and by the way, these operate on 87 octane fuel, we don't have any problem with the typical knock, pre-ignition or detonation that is so typical of a spark ignition engine. These are downspeeded. They do run at a lower RPM than we typically see with a gasoline engine. The red line on the engines currently in development is 4,500 RPMs. So that is down quite a bit from what we're used to. Not as low as many of our diesel engines, but still quite a bit lower than the typical gasoline engine. So again, we have a supercharger, a variable geometry turbocharger, and a large EGR cooler, which we'll see in just a moment. Variable valve timing, of course, with fast-acting cam phasers, and electronically controlled piston cooling jets. Now, piston cooling jets are nothing new. A lot of engines do have them, but these are electronically controlled so that we can turn them on and off. After a cold start and during warm-up, they're off to allow the piston and combustion chamber to come up to temperature quickly. When we need them, well, we can bring down the combustion chamber temperatures by shooting this oil against the underside of the piston, thereby cooling the piston. And of course, we have an extra lobe on the exhaust can. Again, that's for the rebreath that we've already discussed. A view of the backside of the engine. Here's our turbocharger with the exhaust outlet. But notice this large tube heading up to our EGR cooler, a very large EGR cooler, and again, large tubing feeding down to a much larger EGR valve than we have on traditional engines. We're relying very heavily on EGR with this engine in order to keep our cylinder temperatures within check and reduce our oxidizing nitrogen emissions. So at the end of the day, it makes an engine that's more fuel efficient than a 2-liter diesel while making comparable power and at a lower operating cost with fewer emissions. So, with this system, it appears to be a win all the way around. These are the sources that I used to come up with this information for this presentation, and I'd like to thank you for your time.